In a world where many people see reality as a circle or a rectangle, the truth is that issues are cylinders. Rather than a two-dimensional understanding, we will flush out the three-dimension complexities through nuanced conversation and civil, respectable discourse to highlight all perspectives on controversial issues. I'm your host, William Roosh, a high school teacher who's trying to transform education as we know it. Welcome to the Anti-Echo Chamber. This is Cylinder Radio. Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. I'm your host, Will Roosh, and today I have on Samantha Hedges. She is a doctoral candidate in policy studies at Indiana University. She is a former elementary school teacher at Chicago Public Schools. After that, she was a professional policy advocate for after-school programming for the state of Illinois, and now she is my co-moderator of the Heterodox Academy's K-12 education group. We're going to be discussing educational policy. So for you teachers out there, this is kind of aligned with what we both do, which is in education. So I'm hoping to reach some teachers out there to improve what it is that we all do in this world of education. So Samantha, thank you for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
So we talk fairly often now because we're both part of this group for Heterodox Academy. But can you just so we know a little bit about each other, but can you introduce yourself to the audience, tell us a little bit about you, aside from what I just kind of broke down in your little bio thing, and what also got you into wanting to be a part of the Heterodox Academy, maybe what that is for the people that don't know, and then why educational policy, just a little bit about yourself to kind of set it up, why you'd be the person to talk to when it comes to educational policy.
Sure. So just kind of to elaborate on your introduction of me. So as you mentioned, I started as an elementary teacher in Chicago. And from there, I came into the teaching profession kind of at the very beginning, or I was in college at the beginning of No Child Left Behind. And so by the time I got into the classroom, it was kind of in full swing. And it might have been the same for you, actually. And so one of my concerns when I started teaching was that it was not this creative endeavor that was, all about learning that I thought it was going to be. And I think my college professors also didn't know that, they weren't quite sure what this was actually going to look like in the classroom because it was all new when a regime is so test heavy, especially at the elementary level. And especially in the type of schools that I worked in, which were mostly low income or students from low income families. And so doing well on the test was the most important thing. And so that was kind of disheartening for me as a teacher because it wasn't what I anticipated it being. So from there, then I decided to get my master's in social work, and I focused more on the macro level, so policy, rather than being a social worker in schools or a counselor in a nonprofit organization. And so from there is kind of when I was like, okay, policy is the thing that can really make a difference. It's more of a long-term difference than being a teacher, where you get to see kind of day-to-day effects of your job. So it's more of the long haul, and you win some and you lose some and whatnot. But I just kind of saw that as more impactful type of work, which is why I became a policy advocate, mostly focused on after-school programs, but I did some other policy advocacy within the organization that I worked at, because we also focused on early childhood education, social emotional learning, and things of that nature. And during that time, so I used to go advocate in the Illinois State House often. And so when you're down in Springfield or in any state capital, you notice that evidence or research is very rarely used to inform policy or talk about policy for that matter. So it's all very anecdotal, and education tends to be more emotion-based anyway when people are arguing for policies. So there was a distinct time when I was down in Springfield that I was like, I can't do this anymore. Like we have to be more grounded in research in our advocacy efforts. And so that's when I decided to pursue my PhD, which has led me to where I am today. And to get to your other question, Heterodox Academy, I came to know that it existed when James Damore, is that his name?
James Damore, yeah, the
yeah,
Google memo. Yeah.
Yeah. So when that was circulating, and we might talk more about this, but in the age of social media and the internet, it's really hard to find out what is true and accurate. So I was like, okay, I'm going to find this original memo, his version of it, not any tainted version, and try to figure out what's going on here. And Heterodox Academy, one of their faculty affiliates or members, had published kind of what was true of his statements and what was kind of like sort of true or half truths. And also they elaborated more on the research behind what he was saying. So I was like, okay, this is what I'm looking for, because at this point I was a second year grad student getting my PhD, and I was just kind of like already a little jaded, thinking that actually the people who were doing research weren't always engaging in an unbiased way. We always try to be as unbiased as we can, but that doesn't always happen. And so I really came to value Heterodox Academy and immediately became a member, because I thought that it seemed like they were really trying to do that. And they've just accelerated from that. At that point I was pretty new, and they've accelerated from there.
Yeah. I mean, what they're doing is so important. And because I'm not in the graduate doctoral programs, you have to be either pursuing or have your PhD. They call it like a terminal degree. And I don't. So I had to kind of backdoor my way in a little bit to be a part of this group. But I think what they're doing is so important. And it was great to be linked up with you now, because you have one very important part in that policy part. And then I have the classroom, more like boots on the ground. You're like the in the general side, like telling the troops what to do. I'm on the ground. And I think together we can hopefully, hit up what's really going on in the schools. When you were a policy advocate, so how you're essentially like a lobbyist?
Yeah, we don't like to use that word.
Yeah.
So I personally was not a registered lobbyist. We had 2 or 3 people in our organization that were, because we were a nonprofit. So only roughly 10% of your staff is allowed to advocate without jeopardizing your 501c3 status. So I was not a registered lobbyist for our organization, but I could go down and educate, quote unquote. So I could talk to legislatures up into the point where there was an actual bill. So I could talk to them about after-school programs, but once there was, for example, a budget bill, that's what we advocated around a lot, was getting money in the budget for after-school programs, early childhood education, things like that. I could not say, vote for XYZ. Right. So I just told them about the benefits.
Well, yeah, I mean, lobbyists do get like they have a bad reputation. There's a stigma attached to that. But at the end of the day, I mean, I teach government. It's like, how are our representatives supposed to know everything about everything? So, right. You have access. I mean, obviously wealth comes into it and how much money is behind them, but you have access to these people to tell them what's going on. Now people are going to have a specific agenda, but you're advocating for like after school programs. I mean, it's a little bit different than, advocating for a giant, oil subsidy or something like that. But there are, right, in policy, just starting from that level, because you've been there, where the areas where people are, state houses, or, eventually, hopefully you're going to be in DC, advocating for some important changes. Like, I mean, I guess, are you surrounded by people that do have specific agendas, that do have, I want to push this, maybe this is just picking one out, like a vegan diet. So maybe we should have, vegan food in schools, because they have a giant company that produces vegan pizza and stuff. So there is that element of it. And are you going to be surrounded when you're going to pursue this career in policy? That's something you're going to be up against, right? Or is it not as present in something like education?
It certainly is. And like I mentioned, what led me to get my PhD was a concern that evidence was not being used. And I think this is actually, my research is on intermediary organizations like the one that I worked for, that advocate for education policies and to what extent they use research in their advocacy efforts. And it is often the case, like very often the case,
Yeah.
that you have a position before you choose your research. And it's not to say that their position is not a good one, or that there's not value behind it, or that there's not legitimate research to back it up, but they have decided that after school programs or early childhood programs, whatever it is, are inherently good. And they start from that premise and go from there. And so and but what often happens, and this is when the conversation becomes hard, because if you can agree that this is a good thing, that we should have these programs available, then you shouldn't be arguing against them. But what if this program that you're advocating for does not do what you say that it does? Like, to me, that's a problem. And especially when you're using public money, this taxpayer money, to pay for it, and it's not doing what you're claiming. So it's often a problem, I would say. I mean, I've been in DC, but most of my experience is in state government, that you have people that are coming with these positions already, and then it gets to the point where they're fighting against each other, because everyone wants their slice of the pie. And instead of coming together, their funding for their organization depends on them getting a policy passed, getting a program started, getting funding allocated. And so that becomes a big tension. And the time I mentioned when I was in Springfield that I was like, okay, I can't do this anymore, there were advocates literally arguing over who gets to sit, and because they had cut down the amount of people that are allowed to testify in the budget hearing. Who got to do that? Is it the early childhood people, the after school people? What matters more? Who gets to sit at that table? And so I think that's really when the problems come in, is there's not an aligned effort, and people have already decided what is good.
Okay. Yeah, it's starting to make sense now why something like the Heterodox Academy would be so important for you. Like just being in that world, because people with preconceived ideas, or, how could you not support after school programs? And that gets put up. This candidate didn't support after school programs.
Mm-hmm.
Like, not going the details of what was that after school program. Maybe it was complete nonsense. Like, maybe it was doing bad stuff. And that gets us into the idea of, social justice policy, which is, and we're going to go down this road, is essentially taking over as a focal point of educational policy across the country. And that's another one that I did a podcast with James Lindsay, and he broke down what social justice theory is. And if you haven't listened to that, like, speaking to the audience, like, please go listen to it, especially if you're a teacher, because he breaks it down in such a way that reveals what it is. And social justice is one of those things where it's like, how could you be against it? Just like after school programs.
Yep.
And then when you break it down and you see what it is, you read the canon, you go, oh, it's not what I thought it was. It's actually doing harm. There are things you can do that are after school that can do harm. We can all agree on that. So there's no guarantee that an after school program that has good intentions is going to do good. And that brings us into, the social justice idea. And if you know that to be true in certain areas, let's just apply that to all areas, and let's base what we believe to be good or bad on data and on really understanding the topic. Would you agree with that?
Yes. And I do think, there are certainly studies, not just in education, but things that have been done in the name of research over history that were problematic. So I would say simply focusing on evidence and data is not always a perfect system. But for me, that is the starting point. Because, like I said, these are children's lives. These are families' lives. This is taxpayer money that you're using. You want to make sure that what you say you're doing is what is actually going to happen. And I think a lot of what's going on with social justice is it is not at all grounded in research. And that's when it becomes problematic in a university, that especially R1 institutions, which are research institutions that have a heavier focus on research than teaching, that is where knowledge is produced. And so when the social justice agenda that does not align with, what is happening outside of the university, oftentimes these things, it's an echo chamber and it's not grounded in what's actually happening in communities and schools and things like that, kind of clouds the judgment of researchers. And I'm sure James Lindsay could point that out, because he was one of the people successful of getting something published in an academic journal that was not real.
Yeah, several of them. Their story, him and Peter Boghossian and Helen Pluckrose, is really fascinating. You could just Google like hoax papers or something like that. Mm-hmm. But when I say that this is become a focal point of educational policy, it is actually like taken over to a certain degree the colleges of education and the way that we view what is the best way to teach. And this happened quick. I mean, if you're talking about, looking at, Peggy McIntosh and Kimberly Crenshaw and Robin DiAngelo and all that, that's like not that long ago. I mean, that's less than a generation ago, really, or maybe one generation ago. And it's taken over the educational system. And this stuff hasn't been stress tested at all. Mm-hmm. And we're going to say, this is what we should be teaching our children. Well, maybe. I mean, and like all of these ideas of social justice, I'm not saying that they're all bad. I don't think you are either. It's just we need to test them out. We need to see, are they good or bad, and not just assume that they're all good. But you go to any college of education, that's a big focus. And then I've had on both two different National Teachers of the Year. I had on Sydney and I had on Mandy. And they're great, really dedicated educators, and they are very much social justice warriors. And Rodney Robinson, I think his name, just won for 2018. He is also like very, social justice oriented. I mean, this is what we hold up as the best teachers in the country. So there's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. This is what we see as the best way to educate. And I think that they're excellent educators. I also think that they might be a little unfamiliar of what the roots are of what they're teaching. But I don't know. Maybe that's not fair of me to say. I don't know.
Yeah, I think some of it, because I remember, if I think back now to when I was an undergrad, I remember reading Peggy McIntosh, and not so much reading her, but there was a list of things about white privilege that I remember. And, I thought about it, like one of them that stuck with me was the color of a Band-Aid that you use, and that, white people have been privileged, that the Band-Aid color matches their skin. So stuff like that kind of stuck with me. But as I mentioned, like No Child Left Behind had just passed, and that was blasted constantly in my courses. And then the idea of color blindness was something that had become not appropriate. You shouldn't be thinking that way. So stuff like that I didn't even reflect on until recently, that you don't even notice is kind of getting ingrained in your young self who hasn't been in a classroom yet, unsupervised, and who doesn't really know the implications of pushing certain messages when you're in getting your undergrad degree.
Yeah.
So I do think, it's at least been going on since both you and I were in college. But then you get into the classroom and you're like, these are young people who need skills. Like, they need skills to be able to leave this institution and live a good life. And the standards of a good life in the United States, whether people like it or not, is to be able to get a good job and make decent money. And that's something that is, capitalism is something that in schools of education, I'm sure in other social science departments, gets blasted all the time. I'm like, you can argue against it all you want. This is our reality, and we need to make sure kids are prepared for it. Full stop.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, could probably spend the whole hour talking about this, but I think at the end of it, like, we're just looking for, let's have the best education system possible. And we can't just make assumptions that ideas are good or bad without doing like a real deep dive into figuring this out. Do we have a more important job to do than make sure that we're educating our children? Like that seems to be the top priority. And it also seems, maybe I'm biased because I'm an educator, but how we solve all the other problems. I mean, capitalism isn't the problem. It's unregulated capitalism and wealth in the hands of certain people. It's not even extreme wealth. That's not the problem, because I want Elon Musk to have, I'm worried that Tesla could go out of business before he makes some sort of rad battery that powers my house in 10 minutes. Like, I want him to have more wealth, but then the guy with the gold-plated yacht, let's take some of his. And that's just, so it's not, these things are complicated. And I just think that we really need to do some work on this and be willing to admit when we're wrong. And that's a good thing, and go, oh, okay, yeah, I have some blind spots, because we all do. And that's just, I think, really important, and sometimes hard for educators to do, because of our temperament. Our personality is one that we just really care. We care about our students, right. And our intentions are so good that can be manipulated sometimes.
Yeah. And I do want to kind of go back to, or mention, research that happens in universities and the connection to education policy. So I will say that perhaps, I don't know, but perhaps part of the problem of why a lot of researchers focus on what interests them, like that is a driving factor, which there's no problem with that, as long as you're doing rigorous research. But because it is very personal, it doesn't have to exist in the real world. And actually, universities are not incentivizing that research exist in the real world. So if you want to be a tenured professor at a university, I'll speak about research institutions in particular, you have to have X amount of things published, and it has to be published in academic journals. Books can also count, but academic journals count more than books do often. And the people who read those articles in academic journals are other academics. There's a paywall. People usually don't access them. They're not even written in a way that is easily translatable into policy or practice. And so I think that's part of it too, is there's not even an incentive to produce research that matters in policy and practice, or that can even be applied to policy and practice. And I'm someone who, I do not think that researchers should, there's this thing called advocacy research now. I mean, that phrase could have been around for a while, but there's kind of a debate around whether that's what you should be doing. And I am on the side of, no, that's not what you should be doing, because that clouds your judgment. If you already know you're going to be using your research to advocate before you start the research, you kind of need to see what comes out, write some implications, then try to get them in the hands of the people who can use them. But there's not necessarily an incentive to do that. And in education, there's a lot more research to practice partnerships going on, but it's like researchers and teachers are speaking totally different languages. They exist in different worlds. And so then that kind of shields researchers from having to produce things that can exist, or hold up in the real world.
Yeah, I've tried to read some. I think it was either Barbara Applebaum or Robin DiAngelo, and it was so hard to read. Like, I get that a lot of educators are probably just like, I don't know what these doctoral, students or, PhD people are saying, but I'm sure it's, helping marginalized groups. So if they say it, then it must be true. And I think there's a lot of that. But when it comes to policy, like, isn't this, I think this is related. I mean, isn't this a 10th Amendment thing? Like, it's not mentioned in the Constitution. So shouldn't this be a more localized thing? And even No Child Left Behind, that's a federal mandate. And a lot of stuff that's coming down, it's from the federal level. but the localization, because, if you go to school, like policies in maybe New York City or LA, San Francisco would make sense to be, a lot more progressive. But then if you go to school in Alabama, it might be, like I know in Texas, the state standards, they don't even have like Jim Crow in the state standards of Texas. So there's, this is a problem. Blindness is a problem, not just of like the woke left. It's a problem, period. And I think it's just more because it's like a new thing. It's a more new thing, I think, of the left. That's why it gets a lot more focus. But isn't this supposed to be a more localized thing? And what are your thoughts on that element of it? Because like Betsy DeVos is perhaps the most hated person I can think of. Like, I mean, it is unbelievable how hated she is as the education secretary. And I mean, I haven't talked to a single teacher, a single one who's like, you know what, she's great. Like not one. Okay. Even conservatives just like, yeah, she's terrible. Like, what are your thoughts on that element of like, what is the federal government's role in education? Should this be more localized? Things like that.
Yeah. So I'm pretty staunch advocate of the federal government not at all being involved. And the not at all part has been more of a recent thing for me. I've always felt like education is a local thing. Even working for Chicago Public Schools, I felt like that school district was too big. It needed to be broken apart because you don't even know who these people are who are making decisions that impact your school. So I've always been more on the side that it is very context dependent. Now I can recognize that often we're a much more mobile society than we used to be. So people are going to leave and, perhaps, or are likely going to leave and move to another city or another state or things like, so there are some things as a country that maybe should be transferable. But with that, I have faith in local context that they understand what's going on in the world and can prepare their students for that. I think No Child Left Behind has pointed out the negative side of having such overreach from such a high level. Again, these are people you will never meet, you will never talk to. You go to DC and try to meet with your members of Congress, good luck. You're likely to get a 25-year-old staffer who's going to be the one to sit down and talk to you. So I am more on the side of not having the federal government involved, and it's not mandatory that they be involved. I would love one day to see a state test this out and decide to exit that system. They would lose money. About 10% of their funding comes from the federal level. But I think it would be an interesting experiment in what you can do to meet the needs of your students when you don't have such carrot and stick type measures in place.
Yeah. Well, that's what the United States is supposed to be, is these little laboratories all around discovering what is the best way to run a state. I mean, Colorado with medical or recreational marijuana is a perfect example, or California with medical marijuana. But it's successful. So then other states are looking, like when they were going to legalize recreational marijuana, everyone was like, "Oh, let's see where this goes. This could get really crazy. The Capitol building's going to be all tie-dyed and stuff." And then it's like, oh, it goes well, and drunk driving accidents are down, and they have all this extra revenue and all this stuff, and then other states go, oh, okay, like they were the kind of the canaries in the coal mine, and then other states can adopt it. And why can't education be that way too? Like, hey, we're gonna have, maybe in the South, we're gonna have a school that doesn't teach about racial injustice and the sharecropping system and Jim Crow, and let's see if that serves people well, because I think it won't. And maybe the fear is that, well, then they're going to push for, it's the fear of states' rights goes back to segregation and slavery, of there are certain things that are just wrong that we know now to be wrong, but they went so long because in the name of states' rights. So we almost went too far the other direction. We just have to find that balance again.
Yeah. And I think, when it comes to, so the federal government involvement was kind of like a slow creep. I have taught an online class about the politics of education, and I point to the A Nation at Risk report that came out when Reagan was in office. And since then, it was like George Sr. introduce voluntary standards. Clinton, went a little further, and then we got to Bush Jr., and then that's when it went all the way and became federal policy. So it's kind of this, I also worry about, you give them an inch, they take a yard. There seems to be no balance, and you can't reverse anything. So that's the thing with policy, and why you have to be very careful, because it is very hard to undo a policy once it has been passed, because then people are like, well, what's going to happen if we don't have it anymore? Like, students now who are in undergrad can't even imagine a system that did not involve high stakes standardized testing. Like, how did you make any decision? One student said to me once, like, how did you make funding decisions? Like, what do you mean we shouldn't have that? So it gets ingrained in your memory. So that's why I think, policy should be a much more careful process than the way it is treated oftentimes. And just to go back for a second to the Betsy DeVos thing, I think that's one of the greatest contradictions in schools of education is people hate that woman, hate her, but will argue to death that the federal government should be involved in education. I'm like, that doesn't make sense, because you can get someone like her 8 years from now again that you will, dislike. Yeah. It's always the possibility of that happening.
Yeah, it's great. I've been actually writing to her office over and over and over again, trying to get her on the show, and it's just not happening. I would give her I really would give her a very honest platform. I love seeking disconfirmation. I love proving myself wrong. Like, I love being proven wrong. I really do. And I embrace that because I'm curious. And I would love to get a side of like her that's like, oh, what's she really thinking? And not just that she's some billionaire who wants to take, rob public schools. But I'm not hearing anything back.
And I try to be sympathetic to people. Like, I have a lot of issues with like philanthropists getting involved in education, especially if they're not from the area. Kind of like, what do you know about Chicago schools that makes you think you can do it better? But at the same time, I'm not going to straight out the gate assume that they're ill-intentioned. I, don't think that's fair, and it's helpful to kind of do your own research and seek out, what it is that they stand for and why they think they can do this so much better than anyone else. Yeah.
And if you're curious, I think it's one of the things in Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay's book. It's called How to Have Impossible Conversations. It's excellent. And one of the things they say is if you're truly curious, you have to go into it assuming they're good intentions. So assume that Betsy DeVos has good intentions. And that's sometimes very hard for people to do. But none of us are the villain of our own story. We're all the hero of our own story. So we don't think of ourselves as being bad. So we're not going to see our actions as being bad. So if you're trying to really understand where we're coming from, you have to go in with that lens. And you can always disagree, but to assume the other's intention is really important. For standardized tests, I think that this is clearly a major part of educational policy. And my theory, and I want to get your thoughts on this, is that it's very hard to quantify education. What makes a good teacher? What does that look like? Because we're in it for the long game, which is a 35-year-old comes up and says, hey, Mr. Roosh, I remember when I was in 10th grade, you did X, Y, and Z, and that just like really hit a light for me, and I'm living a great life, and you had something to do with that. How do you measure that? How do you measure a successful student? Is it a kid who goes off and, works, 90-hour work weeks and misses every one of his kids' baseball game, but drives a Lamborghini? Is it, it's really hard to figure out what this is. So they go, all right, well, I guess standardized tests. And then if they're smart, then it'll show up on the test, not realizing what the truth is. And I taught at 2 public charters where it was all about the test. Because the only way that school got funded was if we tested well. So it was all teaching to the test. And it took away all of the love of learning for these kids. They became robots, and it was really, really unfortunate and gross. So does that seem to be in line with what you think, or what was your take on that?
Yeah. Yes. I am not. So this gets into dangerous territory that I'm careful in how I talk about with certain groups of people, but I don't know that equality should be our goal. And that's what standardized tests are trying to do. That was No Child Left Behind. Is like, we need to break out subgroups. We need to know which groups of students are performing at what level, and we need to adjust so that everyone is the same. And I think that, fundamentally goes against what a teacher does in a classroom. Is you try to meet the needs of your students, and you try to raise them up from where they are to, something that's going to be a better outcome for them, whether that's academic, life, whatnot. And it just is that's a very difficult thing to do when you're so focused on making sure that everyone produces the exact same results, to the point where, and people don't like to talk about this, I don't know why, but you're disadvantaging this student that's further ahead just as much as you are the one that's behind, because the student that's ahead, they're losing their love for learning while they're forced to, sit here in, I'm mostly thinking about elementary school classrooms, like, sit and learn the exact same things that they already know. They're bored. Now they've stopped paying attention, and then the kid who's behind gets bored, stops paying attention. And in classrooms, we always talked about differentiating learning, which seems to be going out of style, because now in schools of education, that is taboo. Like, a lot of faculty and grad students don't like that idea, because you're calling out students who are behind by
it's like tracking.
It's like grouping. Yeah. And my point, I was kind of shocked the first time I heard someone say this. I'm like, how do you expect me to teach 28 children to learn to read that are all on different levels? Like, that doesn't even make sense that I wouldn't break them out into separate groups that I sat with at different times, to teach reading. So kind of, it seems like I understand the gesture. Like, you want kids to feel included, and you also want everyone to leave with knowledge. But the equality move doesn't seem, equality of outcomes, equality of opportunity I'm all about. Equality of outcomes seems to be like like you are going to leave kids behind because you have decided, that this is the route to take.
Right. Yeah. Calling it equity. I think there's two things. One is standardized tests, we know, don't equate to life success.
Right.
Like, we know that. We all know someone who didn't even graduate high school, who's really successful, brilliant in their field. I was just listening to a podcast recently of this guy who is an outdoorsman and is brilliant. He was on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he said he dropped out of school in 4th grade. So and I know people who got 1,600 of the SATs, and they can't get their lives together. Why we're picking a measurement, even the measurement that we chose isn't very good. But also, when you teach, especially in at-risk communities, you start to see these kids as individuals, and as a whole, the achievement gap exists. Okay, which means Black and Hispanic students are score lower on standardized tests, and I want to address that in a second. But also within that is there are a lot. I have taught so many genius gangsters, like kids who, if they were born in Santa Monica, they would be at the top of their class and they'd be off to be an engineer at Google. But instead they're in whatever Highland Park or something like that, and they're just like they find ways to manipulate a system, or they get away with things, or they're just really smart. I mean, a ton of kids who are really, really smart, and some of them get out and some of them don't. But what you have to see, even within these groups, there are real individuals here, but the groups are achieving less. And why is that is a very important question. Why is it that Asian kids score higher than white kids, and then Hispanic and Black students score lower as a whole? This is as a generalization. And I believe a lot has to do with what's going on in those communities. I'm not going to, put my eggs into the basket of this group is just more capable than the other. I think human beings are way more similar than we are different. And if you do, get the same kind of community situation, all that kind of stuff, we'd all be relatively the same. But you could have a great teacher you could have excellent policy and everything, extracurriculars, all that kind of stuff. But if it's not enforced at home, if, I would teach kids in more than half the class, their parents were illiterate. So like what chance is that? The kids aren't read to, they don't have nutrition at home, their fridge is empty, like all this kind of stuff. If education isn't put as, the one of the most important things, parent teacher conference night was lonely for me. So, almost that probably has a lot more to do with the achievement gap from my estimation, having taught in those schools and have a lot of people that I'm friends with in those communities and come from those communities. It seems like the ones that get out, the ones that achieve, the ones that don't fall into those statistics are the ones who have a better home life. And doesn't seem to be part of the conversation when we talk about the achievement gap. And I think that's really doing us a search for how to solve this problem to service, because you can't solve a problem that you don't really understand.
Yeah, I agree. And I think a student can come from a low income background, have things going on at home and still have a parent that is engaged and dedicated to their education. Absolutely. Partly because they want their child to have a better life than they had. So I think it can happen at any, in any type of home. A parent can be engaged. There's certainly wealthy kids that their parent is absolutely not involved whatsoever in what's going on in school. So I think it happens in a variety of contexts, and I know schools try to push for more parent engagement, and I do think this is also something that almost no one ever talks about, is the fact that school is compulsory. And so what is the effects of school being compulsory? I think one of them might be, and this might be a very subconscious thing, is, well, my child has to go to school, therefore it's your job to educate them. Like, there is, I don't
give up that responsibility.
Yeah. And it's not, and I don't think it's necessarily done in a malicious way. I think it's just kind of a mindset. Like, kids go to school, that's what they do, that's where they learn. So I'm going to send my child to school, and that's where, the teacher is responsible for educating them. And so I think we just need to have more of a narrative about what is, first, put in place some expectations for parents, which, funnily enough, one of the most hated charter school networks in the United States, Success Academy, people complain, about their tactics constantly. Their students, as far as test scores are concerned, are higher achieving. I think they're the highest achieving in New York City, but it's pretty rigid. I mean, you can debate whether what their tactics and how they approach learning is a good way to go. They're basically just doing what the system is asking them to do, which is produce high test scores. And one of the things that they do is they have very high expectations for parents. And they're pretty transparent about that in the beginning. The big meeting where people come together. It's like, if you're an opt-out parent, this school is not for you. If you're, they have, even in writing, things that parents are expected to do. And again, we can argue about whether they're too harsh, but I think they're acknowledging the reality that parents need to be involved if they're, if the students are going to get into elite colleges, which a lot of Success Academy schools do.
Yeah. And and that's it's very much in line with Cylinder Radio, is that sometimes standardized test scores are good. It does show, can this kid read? Can this kid, put together, pick out, whatever, the predicate and the verb and all these things. I don't know if that's a thing. But there is that element too. It's just, you tests are clearly important. Assessments are clearly important. And I think what I'm saying, what maybe we're both saying, is just to use standardized tests as the end all be all is not perhaps the best move. But that's a good example of if a kid can't do these basic things, that's a problem, and that should be focused on.
Yeah. And when I have conversation about standardized tests with people, all of a sudden I'm against testing. That students should not be assessed, that teachers should not be evaluated. I'm like, no. They need to be authentically measure what a student is learning, what we want them to learn. And frankly, focusing on these, again, I mentioned the equality thing, but also it doesn't show that students have learned how to think. It's just shown that they've, learned some facts that they can regurgitate to you. So it's more about how do you authentically test students to measure their interest, their skill sets, and kind of the direction your teaching needs to take to adjust to where your students are at.
Yeah, it's a deeper level. And it's good. I mean, just can a kid remember things and regurgitate it? That's a skill too. Like, if you can't do that, then okay. But like, that's one skill. It's not the most important skill, but that is one skill. And let's, we can focus on that one skill too. I like what you said about, I never thought about it that way, that because school is mandatory, that takes responsibility off of the parents. Because I've read about like cities and countries that have like street cleaners just like out cleaning up garbage. That litter is way higher. People don't throw it out in the garbage can or hold on to it because there's like, oh, someone will clean up after me, and that's their job.
Yep.
That's I never thought about that, but that's a really good point. And I think that probably is more of that is more of a factor than we often think about. Yeah.
Yeah. And because we don't talk about it, it's not a question anymore. It's not up for debate whether school should be compulsory.
Yeah.
And so because it's not up for debate, we don't think about the implications of school being compulsory.
Yeah, the largest group that's growing among different schools is homeschooling, though. Homeschooling is growing bigger than any other like private school, charter school, anything like that in the country. So what's the reasoning behind that? What do you think the reason behind that is?
I mean, I think so we talk, this is all speculation, but we talk about education a lot more now than we used to, or at least it seems like, I haven't been around forever, so I can only speak from, my experience so far. So people know more about what's going on in schools, and the narrative is that it's bad. Like, it's bad, things are not going well. Public schools are not doing well. So I think that's part of it. And I've had conversations with parents that are kind of like, I don't know what I'm going to do. Like, and this is in Bloomington, Indiana. And I'm, and I try to be very nice about it, but I was like, it's fine. You're if the schools are good here, like, you'll be fine. But people, if you I forget if like Brookings or Rand or someone does a survey of school satisfaction, and parents are typically satisfied with their own child's school, but think that education system is terrible, like overall, but their school is fine. The system is terrible. So I think that might be part of it, is that people are looking more at it's terrible side. I mean, obviously religion, that is the start of homeschooling, is the Amish community. I know in New York, vaccination is becoming an issue because there's no longer a religious exemption for it. So if you go to public or private school, you have to be vaccinated. And, there's a lot more talk about nowadays whether vaccinations are good or bad. So I think that, comes into decision making. I think there's more movements, like there's more support for parents who are homeschooling. So there's a thing called micro schools that are getting bigger, and their parents can start them, or anyone can start them, but typically it's parents or just people who are concerned with the education system, but it's more like a one-room schoolhouse type model. So they'll be in a church or, someone's home, something like that. And it's not every day, all day, like school would be. But it's an opportunity for parents, especially parents who work, to have the same kind of like homeschool model, but that they don't have to be parents who are at home to do that.
Yeah, well, maybe that could be the little labs that we're not getting with individual state education. I mean, technology exists now that makes homeschooling completely different than it ever was. And I read a book by, I think it was Senator Ben Sass. He talks about how he homeschools his kids, and like they're in like late high school now, and they'll do like a semester on a farm and then a semester at a law firm, and then a semester. It's like really, and then they're involved in gymnastics or whatever it is, so they get peer groups, and they kind of can cover all the bases. And I remember reading that and I was like, oh, that's interesting. I always thought that homeschooling was just weirdos who weren't going to be socially adjusted and all that kind of stuff. And then what it broke down in the book was interesting. It's like in traditional, say, high school, you're grouped, you only see people who are your age, so you don't have a lot of interaction with old people or like boomers or whatever, and then you don't have the interaction with younger kids, and you don't have so you can pick that all out for your kid if you're homeschooled. And I hope that we don't all just turn into homeschooling as the only way to get a good education. That's why you're here. That's what I'm sure what you're focusing on is how do we get the best ideas into regular schools, and what does that look like, whether it's project-based learning or whatever, that we can use technology now for a lot of different things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I will say that I think one of the most harmful things that education scholars who are full-heartedly behind traditional public schools, and there is no other way, charter schools, nothing, you just cannot think about anything other than traditional public schools. I think one of the problems is none of them are thinking about, like, why does it have to be in a school building, grades sorted by age? Like, you don't have to, but it's very hard to get people out of that mindset, because then they think that there's this slippery slope that's going to take us into education is privatized now, things like that. And actually, part of my research is in New Zealand, and a woman I was talking to there, who used to be the Secretary for Education, she had said the same thing in New Zealand. She's like, one of our biggest problems is that people are not talking about the fact that learning doesn't happen in the classroom anymore like it used to. Like, there are so many other avenues for students that you don't actually have to be in a classroom. And one of her examples was a kid can get on his phone, look something up, and tell you you're wrong, but you're not telling me the accurate information. So I mean, my thing is more of a competency-based mastery, where kids are doing their own thing, kind of Montessori style, through the whole system.
Yeah,
I think is a good way to go about it, because we have what we need to do that. There's so much information out there.
Yeah, that's actually I think how I got Mandy Manning to agree to come on my podcast, the 2016 Teacher of the Year, is she's very frustrated with that. Like, this is the only way to do education model, the antiquated model. Then it makes sense that she lumps in with that. Like, this is a very focused on white supremacy model too. Like, this is just lined up for the straight white man type of stuff, because that can be seen as the same side of the coin, essentially, like the old traditional crusty white man way of doing things. So I see why that would be the case. The last question I have for you is, when you're looking at policies from around the globe, like, let's look at who's doing it right and who's doing it wrong. So maybe Scandinavian countries. I've heard about Finland forever, how amazing Finland is. And when I hear that in other areas, I have to bring up, like, well, it's a very homogeneously mixed group. Like, when people say, like, we should be like Denmark, it's like, oh, you want to get rid of all the minorities? Oh, you know what I mean? Like, what are you really saying? Do you want to make it impossible to have immigration? Well, no. Like, right. So, do the educational systems that are really killing it around the world, do they apply here better than some of the other areas, like wealth areas and things like that? What are your thoughts, like, of like who's doing it well? And is it better to look at, like, what specific schools, like maybe Ron Clark Academy in Atlanta, or like what schools are doing it better in America? Or is it good to look beyond, to around the world? Or what are your thoughts on that? Who's doing it well?
Yeah. So one of my biggest problems with discussing this is it usually starts with PISA scores, so test scores, or standardized test scores in other states, if we're looking at within the system. So I don't even know how to have that conversation, because that is our metric for deciding whether a school is good or not. So unless you're like going and doing more observational data collection, I think it's really hard to know who's doing what well. Like, New Zealand would be an example for Indigenous education. Like, I mean, they only have, it's essentially one type, the Maori is the Indigenous population. So it's a little bit easier than it would be here in the US, unless we did more state-based curriculum development, then that would make a difference. But they're kind of a model for how you integrate Indigenous culture into curriculum, for example. But usually when we're talking about who's doing it better, it's PISA scores when you're looking at around the world. And so I think it's just hard to know. And there might be some research out there that academics need to do a better job of getting into public discourse. Maybe they know things that that would be helpful. But I taught English in Vietnam for a year. And when I was there, PISA scores came out and they ranked, I think, 12th in math. And we were probably in the 30s, I think. And the Minister of Education, which I thought was very interesting because you do not criticize the government in Vietnam, he basically came out and said, don't model us, because what we do is we prepare our students to take tests. That is our education system. That's what we do. And it's true because, they have exit exams to move like from primary to secondary, then secondary to college. So you have to do really well on those tests in order to move up to the next level and get into a good school. And so I thought that was very telling. Like, yeah, we're doing great if you want to have your kids sitting at a desk all day preparing for tests.
Yeah. So just in closing, I think education is perhaps the most important area for us not to be closed-minded. And, that may be the most important area for us to be thorough in deciding how we're doing this whole process. So other than I want to just put it out there to any educators, educational advocates, or administrators, please reach out to my social media or email at cylinderradio@gmail.com so that you can be a part of the group that Samantha and I are running. Right now, it's just on a Facebook group, but then eventually we'll expand and hopefully go to do conferences and things like that because of what we're doing. I think is really important for educational policy. But Samantha, thank you for being here. Where can people find you? Kind of see what you're up to, and any just parting words about the topic.
Yeah, so I don't get on social media a lot. I try to intentionally not be on too much. So currently you will not find me there. I mean, if you want to reach out by email, my email is slhedges, HEDGES @gmail.com. Otherwise, just please join the Heterodox Academy group. I mean, that's where I plan on having most of my education discussions moving forward. So that would probably be the best place to get in touch with me and have these types of conversations, which I hope you will, and I look forward to it.
Yes. Yeah. So all you do is you go to Facebook, you go in like the little search bar and you type in Heterodox Academy K-12 education, and it'll come up. And then you just request, you have to fill out a little questionnaire. It's pretty short. And then you can come in and engage in the conversation. And we really do welcome all perspectives from educators, because that's how you find out what are good ideas and what are bad ideas. So please come and engage.
Yes, please do.
Cool. Well, that's our commercial, Sam.
Right.
But thank you for coming on here. I thought that this was great, and hopefully we'll start a conversation about the importance of having a better education policy and just always trying to improve and things like that. So really happy that you are an expert in this field and can kind of shine some light on your thoughts and your experiences from this.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I enjoy having these conversations. So hopefully we'll have more in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Take care.
All right. Bye. Thanks.
This has been Cylinder Radio. The success of this podcast and the educational revolution that I hope you will be a part of is dependent on those who find value in it. Please take a few moments to review us on iTunes so the show is more easily found. If there was a perspective on today's topic that was not highlighted in this episode, or you have an idea for an episode topic that you want to understand more deeply, please email us at cylinderradio@gmail.com. Follow me on Instagram @WillRusch, WILLREUSCH. Thank you for your support, and I look forward to the next one.